If you're planning on betting the fights this weekend, this is a video that you do not want to miss, because we're going to be taking a deep dive into all of the main card fights from a betting perspective, and I'm going to be sharing with you hours and hours and hours of research that I hope you're going to be able to earn some extra cash from, or at the very least avoid placing some bets which could cost you money. I've made a profit betting on the UFC every single year for the last 15 years. This year will be no different, and I actually make a profit on 74% of months in UFC live betting. This is one of the most beautiful profitability charts you will ever see, and if you want to join my live betting group, check out the links in the description below and head on over to my website. And I'm really sorry I haven't put out a YouTube video for a while. I think it's been about a month since I've uploaded, but I'm working on a really big project at the moment to launch something that I think you guys are going to absolutely love. I'm currently in the process, and I have been in the process for the last 4 months, of building what I believe to be the greatest MMA website ever built. It's going to be better than Sherdog, it's going to be better than Tapology, it's going to be better than pretty much any MMA site that you've ever seen or used before, and it's about 70% of the way built. So that's going to be coming soon. I've spent a lot of time on it, a lot of money on it, and that's the reason why I haven't been uploading. I've just been pouring as much time as I possibly can into this new website, because as soon as it launches, it's something we're all going to be able to get a lot of value from, and it's a tool that we can use to take betting on the sport of UFC. So just to give you guys an idea of the kind of features that I'm going to have on the new website, we're going to have betting trackers where you could track your individual bets. We're going to have a strategy builder, which is going to enable you to use lots of different data and analytics to build your own profitable betting strategies for the UFC, and you can collaborate with other members in the community on building profitable betting strategies. We're going to have betting competitions as well. Do you have any idea how many times people in the YouTube comments call me a clueless fraud, even though I've made a profit betting on the sport every single year for the last 15 years and have produced one of the greatest profitability charts in the history of sports betting? Do you know how many people still call me a clueless fraud? Well, now I'm going to be able to challenge people and see if they can back up all the shit that they talk. We're going to be able to challenge each other to betting competitions, head-to-head betting competitions, or you can set up private leagues, fantasy football style, with your friends, where you can send them a code, join a league, and have your own individual kind of like league tables, leaderboards. The way that would work, obviously, to police, people inputting the correct odds, is it's going to work off our own odds comparison site. So right now, I use sites like Fight Odds and Best Fight Odds to, show odds for fights and talk about prop bets and all that kind of stuff. Well, not for much longer, because I've built my own odds comparison tool, which is a lot better than Best Fight Odds, and it's a lot better than Fight Odds, and we're going to be able to use that for the betting competitions. So rather than having to manually input names of fighters you want to bet and the odds and which betting site you got it from, and having to have all this moderation around whether people are inputting accurate bets and not fooling around with odds, what we're going to be able to do is, if you want to place a bet on Charlie Campbell at odds of 2.20 and enter it into the betting competition against all your friends, you would literally just click the odds and it would give you the option to enter it into a betting competition. We're going to have prizes, all kinds of incentives for winning tournaments and things like that. It's going to be a lot of fun. Where are we? We've also got a research tool, which we will be using in this breakdown video today. It's already fully built. 70% of this stuff is fully built. We're going to have a fighter database that will be even better than what you find on Sherdog, Tapology, and other sites like that. We'll have our own predictions game. Won't go into a lot of detail with that now, but the predictions game is going to be a lot of fun, because you're also going to be able to use it to kind of get wisdom of crowds analysis on potential value bets based on the perception of the community, the perception that the community has of a fighter winning based on the reality of the odds. You're going to be able to set up odds alerts. You're going to be able to get notified by email or through the website, or depending on your membership tier, by text message, which will let you know when odds for new fights get released. Or you can set up odds alerts for pretty much anything. If you want to be notified every time a fighter's odds change by 5%, 10%, 20%, you can do that. You could do anything you want. And, hopefully you get a lot of value out of that. We'll have a new chat room that will be even better than Discord. We'll have a forum. We will have leaderboards for both betting competitions and predictions competitions, where we'll have weekly, monthly, 6-monthly, quarterly, all-time, yearly competitions, leaderboards, where there'll be prizes up for grabs and all that kind of stuff. We'll have an achievement system which basically gives you authority within the community, which is quite a big deal, because if you have a high level of XP and authority and expertise when it comes to betting on the sport or predicting the sport, if you outperform the community, you'll get more achievements, and that will add more weight to your influence within the community in terms of how important we should consider your predictions and bets to be. And if you do rise up through the ranks and get a lot of achievements, there'll be a lot of perks, prizes, benefits, cash rewards for that as well. Live betting's pretty self-explanatory. We'll be launching a completely new live betting system for my live betting group, which you're absolutely going to love. It will take things to a whole new level and be a very, very interactive experience live betting with me pretty soon. Pre-fight betting tips, pretty self-explanatory. Football betting tips, pretty self-explanatory. We'll broadcast weekly live streams through the website. We won't be using YouTube, we won't be using Twitch. It'll all be done through the website. And we'll also have event schedules so that you can stay up to date and see exactly what's coming, everything that is coming. Like I say, this has been a big project for me. By the time this is all done, it'll probably end up costing around $30,000, so it's a big commitment. But 70% of this stuff is already built. I've spent the last 4 months building it. Most of it is ready to launch very soon. And we'll also have a mobile app launching very, very soon as well. So while you are watching the UFC fights, if the pacing is slow, if you get a little bit bored, there'll be plenty of stuff to keep you busy on the app while you're just sat in front of the TV. You can be playing on your phone, playing around with all this kind of stuff. That is the vision, and it's very close to being done now. It's the reason why the breakdown videos have kind of had to be pushed aside for a little bit, being uploaded very late, missing some breakdown videos. The logic being, it's very time consuming to produce these breakdown videos. They take a lot of planning, and right now I feel the way things are done, it's not optimum, right? Once this site launches, the way everything's going to be done, from breakdown videos to everything else, it's going to be optimum, and there's going to be a lot of automation built into the new website that'll save me a lot of time, which will enable me to get breakdown videos out earlier. So right now, what I'm doing is I'm investing in creating a stronger foundation, a stronger infrastructure for the community and everything that we do, so that in a few months' time, a few weeks' time, a few days' time, any day now, because most of this stuff is built, everything will just run so much better, and you'll have so much more content. You'll get so much more value for money for your membership, and the breakdown videos will be better than ever because I'll have more time to commit to them, and they'll be coming out earlier than ever before. So at the moment, it's just like a transitional period. We really, really need to build this stuff, launch this stuff, get it out. As you can see, most of it is already built. It's just bug fixing and going through the final kind of stages before everything drops. So we're going to be using the research tool in this video today. There are some bugs with it. This isn't the final version of it, but for the most part, as we go through, you'll see that it works pretty damn well. So we will kick things off by breaking down the main event, which is going to be a fight between Carlos Ulberg and Dominick Reyes. So we can see that Ulberg is the favourite at average odds of about 1.40, which is going to be minus 250 for an implied probability of 71.5%. And Dominick Reyes is a 2.97 underdog, which is going to be plus 197 for an implied probability of 34%. And if you're wondering where these odds come from, the way it basically works is I take the average odds across 45 different betting sites globally, and these are basically the average odds taken from 45 different betting sites globally. The way that we ensure the integrity of these odds being the average, the true average, is I've also got logic in place where if there are any websites which are displaying clearly erroneous odds, so sometimes you'll see, like, you might see a website that have got Carlos Ulberg as minus 1,000, 1.01, where it's just clearly an error. If ever there's a situation where the odds deviate from the average by like 20 to 30%, we remove that betting site from the average calculation. So you can be sure that wherever odds you see on the research tool, those are pretty much what the average odds are going to be across 45 different betting sites globally. So yeah, we've got Ulberg 1.40, Dominick Reyes 2.97, and for me this is a very, very interesting fight. So if we bring up the fighter comparison, we can see they're both about the same age, and they're both pretty much identical in size, which is very rare. You don't see that very often. The only real difference from a physical point of view is that Dominick Reyes is more of a southpaw. You know, Ulberg does switch stances a bit, to be fair, but Dominick Reyes is a southpaw-based fighter. Other than that, virtually identical on the tail of the tape. Now, in terms of the stats, you can see that Ulberg lands, you know, a good amount of strikes more per minute, although I would caveat that by saying Ulberg has also fought a far, lesser level of fighter than Reyes. So, you know, this is probably around average, to be honest with you. If you think Reyes has fought, spent 25 minutes in the octagon with John Jones, it's obviously going to bring the average down. They're about as accurate as one another, though. Their striking defense is about the same. Actually shows Ulberg is more likely to go for a takedown, which is pretty interesting. But generally, quite out of character for either of them to go for a takedown, to be honest with you. And in terms of takedown offense, they're both very difficult to take down. And yeah, as you can see from the fighter comparison tool, very even in terms of both, the physical tail of the tape and also the stats. And obviously, fights are fought in the octagon. They're not fought on paper. But when I researched this fight and I studied, the last 2 or 3 fights from both guys, I was struggling to understand the reason why Ulberg was such a big favourite in this fight, because they seem quite well matched skill for skill. And then when I checked the fighter comparison tool, it was quite interesting to see that they're pretty much even on both the tail of the tape and the stats side of things as well. And so obviously we're going to go into how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, but the too long didn't read version of the fucking breakdown is you would have to be a crazy person to bet Carlos Ulberg this weekend at an implied probability of 72%. There's just no upside in betting Ulberg whatsoever. No value. It's a terrible bet. I don't know who in their right mind would be capping Ulberg having a 75% chance of winning this, which is what you would need to cap him at in order to get any value here. It just doesn't make any sense. There are no major advantages for Ulberg in this fight, and in order to justify these odds, he needs to have major advantages. So if you do want to bet the main event this weekend, it's all Dominick Reyes. You've got to take the dog. It's dog or pass, clear as day. Reyes is going to give you the far better risk to reward ratio. Now, in terms of how they match up stylistically, obviously we've seen from the stats, neither of these guys ever tried to take their opponents down. Reyes tried a little bit to take Jiri down when he was badly hurt in that fight, but Ulberg's pretty difficult to take down. Athletic, good balance. This is almost certainly going to be a stand-up fight. And so in a stand-up fight, as Ulberg has started to face a higher level of opponent, we've seen him become much more of a sniper and a technician. In some of his earlier fights, if we bring up his record, in some of his earlier fights, for example, there was the Kennedy and Chukwu fight, there was the Fabio Cherent fight. He was a lot more aggressive, and that got him into trouble against Nchukwu. And against Fabian Cherent, he went to a decision and didn't look very good. And it was one of those situations where I think he learned that he wasn't going to be able to just come out and just starch everyone, and that he needed to fight smarter if he wanted to have longevity in the UFC and put a run together and potentially give himself a chance to win a title. So he started to fight safer and smarter, and so that's why we're starting to see him go deeper in fights. Went to a decision in his last 2, went deep against Da Woon Jung, and now generally what you see from Carlos Ulberg is a guy that controls the distance very well, has very good movement, reads his opponents very well, has that technical sniper style of striking, and he's very difficult to get to. He's very elusive. The downside of that is, even though, to be fair to him, landing 6.77 strikes per minute is well above average. This is a very high number. He's not the most aggressive anymore. And as he's facing a higher level of opponent, he's becoming less and less aggressive. And so this is one of those situations where Ulberg is... he's a tricky style to deal with, but I do also feel he's a guy that may have trouble putting his stamp on rounds. Now, obviously, he's from New Zealand. You know, the event this weekend is taking place in Australia. You can't strictly say Ulberg has got home advantage for this one. He's not an Aussie, but he's certainly going to have the, you know, more of the crowd behind him than he would with Dominick Reyes, right? And so this is one of those fights which I do see potentially being very close, very competitive, because Reyes is more aggressive. I would also say Reyes hits harder. I think he's got more raw power. But Ulberg's far better defensively and more elusive. Is Ulberg more durable? Obviously, we've seen Reyes get knocked out a bunch of times, although in his last three, you know, to be fair, it's difficult to say what's going on with Reyes' chin, because Krylov, Smith and Jacoby aren't power punchers, right? They're all volume strikers. Even Jacoby's a volume striker. So it's difficult to say exactly what is going on, you know, with Reyes' chin, because prior to that, you could see that he was brutally knocked out by Blachowicz, Jury and Ryan Spann. And I would say Ulberg is certainly more dangerous than Krylov, Smith and Jacoby. But having said that, variance is also a big deal in sports, right? And in any other sport, you know, losing 3 matches in a row wouldn't be a big deal at all. Just one of those things. For some reason in combat sports, people get crazy and they really overreact to consecutive losses. And so, on one hand, you know, Reyes getting knocked out in 3 fights in a row might be a sign that his chin is totally terrible. But it could also just be variance and bad luck and a coincidence in this crazy universe. At the end of the day, it's only 3 repetitions, and the example I always use, roulette is a really good example, right? If you look at the probability of, you know, the spin of a roulette wheel landing that ball on a red or black number, it's very close to 50-50. Yet if you go to any casino in the world and you sit by a roulette table for an entire day, you will see, you know, multiple situations where, you know, that ball lands on a red or black number consecutively, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, even 20 times in a row. Yet the probability of that happening is very close to 50-50. So Reyes getting knocked out in 3 fights in a row could indicate his chin is a total joke and that Ulberg is going to come out and starch him. But he's pretty young for a light heavyweight at 35 years old, and he has only had 19 pro fights. It's not tons of fights. It doesn't mean his chin is totally shot. It just means maybe he's had a little bit of bad luck. So if Reyes shows up this weekend at his absolute best, Ulberg is very good defensively. Will be chipping away at Reyes with the leg kicks and the jabs. Reyes hits a bit harder though, lands harder, more damaging, more impactful shots. It's a great fight. It's clearly dog or pass. If you want to bet this fight, it has to be Dominick Reyes or no one. I really hope you found that breakdown useful. In terms of the over-under on this one, you know what? Over 2.5 rounds is pretty damn tempting at odds of around 2.10 plus 110. I do think this fight is likely to go deep. If you take a look at their records, as you can see, as Ulberg has started to face a step up in competition, you know, he's starting to go to a decision more often. If you look at Reyes' record, even though tons of his fights have ended inside the distance over the last few years, prior to that crazy run of knockouts, he was turning into a bit of a decision machine. Went to a decision against OSP, decision against Ozdemir, decision against John Jones. I think this could be a very high-level chess match where both guys kind of point fight and chip away at each other. I don't think this is going to be one of those fights where they just stand and bang and play rock'em, sock'em robots. So that increases the probability of the fight going a bit deeper. If you wanted to place a bet on the over-under, I think the over 2.5 rounds is a good one. Over 1.5 rounds, also very good, to be fair. You know, you've also got to remember this is Ulberg's first time in a 25-minute 5-round fight in the UFC. You know, he has slowed down in some of his earlier fights. The Nchukwu fight, a really good example. So Ulberg may start a bit slower and want to pace himself as well. He certainly started very slow in his last fight against Jan Blachowicz. So it's a great fight. Hopefully you found that useful. And hopefully you can use that information to kind of make some money on this fight. And yeah, let me know what you think on the Discord, or let me know what you think in the comments below. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Jimmy Crute versus Ivan Erslan. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Crute is the favourite at average odds of about 1.46, which is going to be minus 218 for an implied probability of 68.6%. And Erslan is a 2.73 underdog, which is going to be plus 173 for an implied probability of 36.6%. So if we look at the fighter comparison, the age pretty much around about the same. You know, at light heavyweight, 29, 33 years old, bit of a nothing burger. Both guys are the same height. We can see Crute slightly longer reach, slightly longer leg reach. And then if we take a look at the stats, obviously Erslan, if we take a look at his record, he hasn't had many fights in the UFC. He's only had 2 fights in the UFC. So the stats aren't too useful on this one, because obviously he hasn't really spent much time in the octagon to accrue a good amount of data. But we can take a look at Jimmy Crute's stats, which will give us a good idea of what to expect from him. He's very active, even though he slows down a lot in fights. You know, landing 4.37 strikes on average per minute for a light heavyweight is really good. Striker accuracy, 53%, you can see higher than Erslan's, but what we do know about Crute, defensively, he's very bad. So only 42% striker defense. It isn't great. Takedown attempts, you can see, as you'd expect with Crute, far more aggressive than Erslan at trying to get fights to the ground. Shooting 3.86 takedowns per fight is quite a lot, especially because a lot of Crute's fights have ended early. So that goes to show that he's very busy at pursuing the takedown. And you can also see 1.62 submission attempts per 15 minutes. That's quite a lot as well, which indicates when the fight does go to the ground, Crute is extremely aggressive at pursuing the finish. And so the stats for Jimmy Crute pretty much perfectly reflect what you get from him. They pretty much summarize and give clues to his exact style of fighting. And so for me, when you look at how both these guys match up from a stylistic point of view, they are both quite well rounded. But when you watch footage of them, the thing that really jumps out the screen at you is how much more aggressive Jimmy Crute is and how much more passive Ivan Erslan is. So Ivan Erslan is a very frustrating fighter because he's got everything you need to have a decent amount of success in this division. You know, the standard of athlete across the entire division at light heavyweight, it's pretty bad. There's a lot of slow, stuck in the mud guys, or guys with bad cardio. There's a lot of low level guys that you'd think Erslan would do well against. But for me, Erslan is just a guy that finds ways to make life difficult for himself, either through being too passive or by having bad fight IQ. Because if we look at Erslan and just look at face value on what he's capable of, you know, his cardio is good, he's tough and durable, his striking's not bad, his grappling's not bad, yet we get long periods of inactivity from him, periods where he gives up cheap takedowns, periods like against Navajo Sterling where he's facing someone that is very bad on the ground, yet he doesn't try to take them down. He tries to win a kickboxing match against a better kickboxer. And for me, Erslan is one of these fighters that, whilst he has all the skills he needs to beat a guy like Jimmy Crute, those self-destructive tendencies from Erslan are likely to cause him trouble against, you know, a guy that pretty much always shows up. Crute doesn't always win. Crute doesn't always perform well. But he's got the heart of a lion, and he always tries to compete, and he always tries to win. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, you've got to give Crute a huge advantage on the ground. We've seen Erslan give up some cheap takedowns and take a really long time to work through bad positions on the ground. Sterling was able to take him down, rack up a decent amount of top control in the second round. And if you remember the Ion Cutelaba fight, Erslan majorly swung momentum in his favour and was causing Cutelaba big problems, but then gave up cheap takedowns against an absolutely exhausted Cutelaba and just laid on his back and was unable to work his way back up to his feet. Cutelaba scraped by with a split decision win, but it was bloody close, and one of those fights where, again, fight IQ and self-destructive tendencies cost Erslan. He really should have beaten Cutelaba. And so when we look at how these two match up when it comes to grappling, we know Crute is very aggressive with the takedown, very aggressive with the submissions on the ground, very aggressive with ground and pound as well. Crute's grappling control, when he's focused on controlling, is pretty good, very physically imposing, very strong. But because Crute is so aggressive on the ground with pursuing takedown attempts or attacking with submissions or trying to advance position, he does have a tendency to give up position a lot just because he gives his opponents so many opportunities to create scrambles. So that's something to watch about with Jimmy Crute on the ground, but he's much better at working his way back up to his feet than Erslan is. The area for me where Jimmy Crute could really get himself into trouble in this fight, though, is Erslan is quite tough and dogged, and his cardio is great. So what you tend to see from Jimmy Crute, if you look at his fight against Rodolfo Bellato, or you look at his fights against Alonzo Menafield, he is one of these guys that is just all-out attack, non-stop, action-packed, big drama show, and really goes for it hard on the ground. So Crute is a guy that tends to burn through a lot of energy in grappling positions, and if you make Crute grapple, in fact you don't have to make Crute grapple, because he will quite often pursue you with takedowns. But if Crute does spend a lot of time grappling in his fights, he will quite often slow down a lot. And so there are opportunities for Erslan to kind of weather the early storm, drag Crute into deep waters and take over. However, he kind of did that to Cutelaba and still give up cheap takedowns against an exhausted Cutelaba, which really cost him. So on the fight, on the ground, you give a huge advantage to Crute. However, Crute doesn't have the cardio to grapple hard for 3 rounds, and if Erslan fights smart, he could use that to his advantage to really cause Crute problems in the second half of the fight. Now, in terms of striking, Erslan's the more technical out of the two, but he doesn't have any power in his hands, isn't very aggressive, doesn't throw a particularly high volume of strikes. Crute is sloppy and much worse defensively, but he's more aggressive, more active, and hits a lot harder. So in terms of the stuff landing that is likely to get the attention of the judges and score big points, it's going to go to Jimmy Crute. But again, Erslan, if he fought smart, could be able to pick his shots and make Crute pay for his poor defense, especially in the second half of the fight when Crute tends to become very sloppy. And the Rodolfo Bellato fight is a really good recent example of that with Crute, where he was so sloppy in the second half of the fight, overcommitting to punches, just hands down by his side, couldn't keep his hands up, just a total mess. So this is one of those fights where, from a technical point of view, I think Erslan is capable of making Crute look very bad because of how sloppy and how much Crute slows down his fights we're on. But in terms of actually scoring points through landing hard, damaging shots and having success on the ground, that goes to Crute. On top of that, obviously this fight's taking place in Australia. Crute is Australian, so he will have home advantage on his side for this fight. It's also a co-main event, so the crowd are going to be behind Crute big time. And, Erslan lost a close decision to Ion Cutelaba. I would imagine if this fight ended up being close, it would be very difficult for Erslan to beat Crute or win a decision against Crute against an Australian in Australia. We know home advantage will be very big on a fight like this. So I do understand the reasons why Jimmy Crute is a big favourite, but again, for me, just like with Carlos Ulberg, that implied probability of 68.6% is very, very aggressive, because in order to get any value on Crute, you've got to cap him at like 73, 74, 75%, and Crute just isn't the kind of guy that you can ever give that chance of winning to, against anyone in the division, to be fair. The issue with Crute is his cardio is really bad, so you never want to be betting on a guy at an implied probability in the 70% odds range if they've got bad cardio, because they're more prone to adrenaline dumping, they don't pace themselves well. Crute is also reckless and bad defensively, so even though Erslan's not the most dangerous striker, doesn't have much power, ultimately it only takes one clean shot to land and your night is over. And on top of that, Jimmy Crute has also spoken about having issues with mental health and depression, which, you know, this is going to sound like a ruthless thing for me to say, but ultimately it's my job to, you know, assess the chances that both fighters have got of winning a fight based on all the information that we've got available, and do my best to try and find value on one side or the other. And if a fighter has been very open about you know, struggling with mental health issues and has also previously retired, that does make them more likely to underperform in cage fights to death, and therefore makes them more inconsistent and more difficult to trust. And whenever you've got a fighter in that implied probability range of, you know, 70%, you can't afford to have any major risk factors. And, you know, for me, that's too much of a risk factor to roll the dice on Crute. So again, similar to the main event, if you do want to bet this fight, for me it's an absolute no-brainer to take Erslan. Let the odds do the work for you. That doesn't mean I think Erslan is more likely to win. It just means you get a better risk to reward ratio if you bet Erslan. If you bet $1,000 on Jimmy Crute, you're only going to make $460 profit if he were to win. If you were to bet $1,000 on Ivan Erslan, you'd make $1,173 if he were to win. Sorry, $1,730 if he were to win. And so, based on that, it's no doubt that Erslan is the better bet out of the two. He's more than capable of making this a close competitive fight. If you can push Cutelaba to the very limit, to the point where Cutelaba only just scrapes by with a split decision win, you can absolutely do the same to Crute. So in terms of the over-under on this one, in terms of the over-under, where are we? Here we go. So in terms of the over-under, very unlikely this one will go to a decision. Obviously, Crute does aggressively pursue everything that he does. He tries to knock you out, tries to kill you on the ground. Having said that, the over 1.5 rounds in the even money odds range is very tempting on this fight, because if we look at their records, if we take a look at Erslan's record, he does have a tendency to go deep in fights. He's been to a decision in his last two. Sterling's a dangerous striker. Cutelaba, pretty dangerous striker as well. Very aggressive on the ground. Prior to that, against a lower level of opponent, lots of finishes inside the distance. Take a look at Crute's record. Lots of fights have ended inside the distance. However, when he does face a step up in competition, he does quite often go deep. So you can see deep against Menefield and Bellato in 2 of his last 3. I just think in the even money odds range, over 1.5 rounds is quite a good bet, because Erslan has shown against Sterling and Cutelaba that he is a tough fucker and he is quite difficult to put away. He was actually rocked bad against Sterling in the 3rd round and was able to kind of weather the storm, hang in there and survive, which was quite impressive. And he was put in some bad positions on the ground by Cutelaba as well and was able to weather the storm and hang in there. Granted, Crute, you know, is more dangerous than Cutelaba on the ground in terms of his aggression with ground and pound and also his submission game, but over 1.5 rounds, I think it's a decent chance that hits. I mean, if we look at the implied probability on over 1.5 rounds, if I just bring up the implied probability calculator here, and we look at the average odds, call it about, say, 1.80. If we pop 1.80 in, we can see that gives us an implied probability of about 56%. I think it's more than reasonable to cap the over 1.5 rounds hitting at 60 to 65%. So that's not a bad bet. I probably will go for that. Yes, it'll probably be a sweat, because Crute will bring death, chaos, destruction and violence. But I think Erslan's tough enough to weather the storm, and Crute's a pretty tough fucker as well. So I do like that quite a bit. So, hope you found that useful. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's break down the fight between Jack Jenkins and Ramon Taveras. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Jenkins is the favourite. Average odds of about 1.34, which is going to be minus 290 for an implied probability of 74%. If we take a look at Taveras, he's a 3.26 underdog, which is going to be plus 226 for an implied probability of 31%. Looking at the fighter comparisons, we can see that both guys are the same age, about the same height, and we can see that Taveras has a small reach and leg inch reach advantage. We can see that Jenkins likes to switch stances. Taveras is a southpaw. In terms of the stats, Taveras has only had 2 fights in the UFC. They did go the distance, to be fair, and they were stand-up fights, so his striking stats are going to be somewhat useful for us to measure against Jenkins. But with only 2 fights in the UFC, obviously it's not a massive sample size of data. But we can see both guys land around about the same number of strikes per minute, although Jenkins has spent a lot of time on his back in fights. And so that would obviously have an impact on how many strikes he can land per minute, because you can't land strikes off your back you know, if you've been taken down and held down. You can see though that Jenkins is more accurate with his strikes, slightly better defensively, and more likely to go for takedowns as well. Taveras has been involved in 2 completely stand-up fights in his first 2 matchups against Davy Grant and Sergey Siddy, whereas we've seen a bit of everything from Jenkins. He is predominantly a striker, but a couple of his fights have involved quite a lot of grappling, including his last one against Gabriel Santos, which I am going to be showing you some footage of. It's a fight that Jenkins lost by rear naked choke. So in terms of how these 2 match up from a stylistic point of view, they're both strikers. Neither of them tries to take each other down very often. I know you can see you know, a couple takedown attempts on average per fight for Jenkins, but for the most part he wants to stand and bang. He's a striker, and so when it comes to striking, this is going to be one of those fights that I think could actually be pretty competitive. So we're going to get into the details behind how they match up when it comes to striking in a moment, but first I just kind of want to get grappling out the way, so that you guys can understand why, unfortunately, same as with Ulberg, same as with Crute, you would have to be a crazy person to bet Jack Jenkins at these odds, because an implied probability of 74% on Jack Jenkins is utterly absurd. Whenever you see odds like this, you should only ever consider playing them if a guy has no major weaknesses, you know, no huge red flags, or no things that could lead to him kind of getting exposed, right? You don't want any major issues with them in this odds range. You should only ever bet guys in this odds range when they have virtually no way to lose, and the only way you're going to lose is if something crazy happens, like the fighter gets injured, or you know, disqualified, or something crazy happens you don't see coming, right? So the issue with Jack Jenkins is he's extremely weak off his back. So that probably isn't going to be an issue in this fight, because Taveras is a striker that never tries to take fighters down. However, if the UFC was easy to predict, myself and every single one of you watching this would be billionaires. And there probably aren't any billionaires watching this video, and I'm certainly not a billionaire. And so for that reason, when betting fighters or dealing with fighters in the odds range that Jenkins is in, you should always proceed with caution. So I'm going to be flicking through this Santos fight very quickly to show you a huge chink in Jenkins' armor, a huge issue with Jenkins that should make you consider taking him in this odds range. So here you can see there's about 50 seconds left on the clock in round 1 when he gets taken down. Santos takes him down in the half guard, and what you'll see from Jenkins in this fight is whenever you put him on his back, he's very, very weak off his back. So it's only 50 seconds, but Santos holds him down for the rest of the round relatively easily. Now you could let Jenkins off the hook and say, well, there was only 50 seconds left in the round. You know, maybe he didn't think there was enough time left in the round, or that it would be worth committing a bunch of energy to get back up. Fair enough. So if we go into round 2, though, you will see that Jenkins' takedown offense is a little bit sketchy. So Santos with a body lock up against the cage hits a nice outside trip. Now, this is a far better situation for Jenkins to be in, right? He's a little bit closer to the cage, which means, you know, it's easier for him to scoot his butt over to the cage and wall walk from here. And he's got 3.5 minutes to work back up to his feet. There's only 1.5 minutes into round 2. But you can see as Santos hits that outside trip, Jenkins just goes to close guard here. And then if we skip through, you can see that, you know, he's been on the ground for 1 minute now. At this point, he's been on the ground for 2 minutes. It took him 2 minutes to get his back anywhere near the cage to put himself in a position to wall walk. At this point, he's been on the bottom for 3 minutes, and basically Jenkins gets taken down a minute and a half into round 2 and spends the whole of the round on the ground. So naturally, with how much success Santos had in that position, he's going to want to get the fight back to that position. So early in round 3, does a very smart thing, shoots a nice double leg. It wasn't a very nice double leg, actually. It was poorly timed and high up above the hips. But because Jenkins' takedown offense is so bad, he finds a way to make use of the position to get to Jenkins' back and lock up this body triangle. And now he's in the backpack position, which isn't ideal because his legs are going to get tired. And he's in danger here of slipping off very high up on the torso of Jenkins. By this point, Jenkins is very tired, can't support the body weight of the two of them, so drops to his knees. And as we skip through, you can see just gets smashed and choked out. So I don't want this breakdown video to be super long. I could show you footage from, Jenkins' other fights which highlight similar issues with him, with his takedown offense, his choices on the ground, how weak he is off his back. But for me, if you understand what probabilities mean, in order for Jenkins to justify this probability of winning, he shouldn't have any major weaknesses. No fighter that is that easy to take down and that bad on the ground should be a 74.4% favourite over anyone in the UFC. It's just illogical, because in order to get any decent margin of value on Jenkins, you'd have to give him an 80% chance of winning, which you can't do because he's got such a huge weakness that with how big that weakness is, anyone in the division, if they really commit to and choose to, has a really reasonably good chance of making him pay for that. So this is one of those fights where that issue with Jenkins probably isn't going to mean anything, because Taveras likes to stand and bang and is probably not going to try and take Jenkins down. Therefore, it'll be a stand-up fight, and Jenkins, won't have to worry about his takedown offense and ground game. But there's always that chance that Taveras might think, you know what, rather than stand and banging and risking getting knocked out or losing a decision against, an Australian in Australia, like, Taveras is going to be realistic. Jenkins is a tough fucker. Ain't going to be easy to knock him out. It's not going to be easy to win a decision against Jenkins in Australia. Taveras might be thinking to himself, this guy absolutely fucking sucks on the ground, so rather than playing rock'em sock'em robots, why don't I just try and take this guy down and do what Santos did and get that win bonus and keep my job in the UFC, further my career, make life better for myself and my family. Is Taveras going to do that? Probably not. Taveras is probably going to stand and bang and is probably going to end up losing a decision against Jenkins. But at an implied probability of 74%, you can't afford to take that risk. You just can't afford to do it. Because just to break even on bets in this odds range, you've got to win 3 out of 4 bets. You've got to maintain a long-term win rate of 75%, which is extremely difficult to do on guys like Jack Jenkins that have major holes in their game. So that's how they match up on the ground. Now, in terms of how they match up when it comes to striking, Taveras is actually a pretty good boxer. I was quite surprised to see him get outboxed by Davy Grant. But to be fair, Taveras is a pretty good boxer. But that's basically all he does. All he does is box. Doesn't really throw too many kicks. Doesn't try and take you down. Likes to stand and bang. Also, he's very technical, but he doesn't really have too much power in his hands, which is where you run into trouble against Davy Grant. Taveras is a more technical boxer than Davy Grant, but Davy Grant just hit harder. So he was landing the harder, more damaging shots. And I think Taveras is going to have the same problem against Jenkins. Jenkins isn't that technical, but he does have that raw power, and he's a lot more aggressive. So when these guys exchange, whilst Taveras might look better in the exchanges and more technical, Jenkins is likely going to be the guy landing the harder, more damaging shots, the guy landing the big shots, gets a reaction from the crowd, the guy that leaves that impression on the judges. So I think they're reasonably well matched when it comes to striking, but Jenkins is a tough fucker, and it will not be easy for Taveras to win a decision against an Australia Australian in Australia, especially when we've seen him struggle to impose himself physically on Davy Grant, who's almost 40 years old, and now he's facing a younger, hungrier bull in Jenkins, who has got that tankiness about him. So Taveras comes into the fight, use a bit of grappling. This one could get very, very interesting, but I don't think he will. Therefore, the most likely outcome is going to be Jenkins, more than likely by decision, actually. Taveras is a tough fucker, even though Jenkins hits hard. Taveras is tough, he's durable. I think this one probably does go deep, which brings me on to taking a look at the over-under for this one. And we can see that the bookies also agree with me that it's more likely to go to a decision. Because this is going to be a stand-up fight, both guys are going to stand and bang. I personally wouldn't bet on this fight to go to a decision because, you know, it's on the main card. Crowd are going to be hyped up. Jenkins is one of these aggressive guys that does feed off the energy of the crowd. He probably is going to go for it and look to take Taveras out. So the odds aren't good enough for me to bet on this fight to go to a decision, but I think it's more likely to. And the most likely outcome for the prop bettors are going to be Jack Jenkins by decision. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. And now let us move on to the next one. So now let's break down the fight between Jake Matthews and Neil Magny. So Matthews is a favourite at average odds of about 1.24, which is going to be minus 425 for an implied probability of 81%. And Neil Magny, 4.16 underdog, which is going to be plus 316 for an implied probability of 24%. Austin 316, man. The WWE Attitude Era. What a time to be alive. All the 90s babies will get where I'm coming from, man. World's gone mad. Those are simpler times. So in terms of the tail of the tape, we can see that even though Jake Matthews has been in the UFC forever, I think at one point he might have been the youngest fighter to ever compete in the UFC, or the youngest lightweight or something anyway. In fact, he might have entered the UFC as a welterweight, I can't remember. But either way, Jake Matthews is 7 years younger than Neil Magny. So even though he's had a lot of fights in the UFC and he's been in the promotion forever, bounced around between lightweight and welterweight, he's now at welterweight and very young for a welterweight at 30 years old. Magny, on the other hand, at 37, is going to be declining a lot from fight to fight, and we are seeing that decline in Magny. So we can see Magny has a 4-inch height advantage and a 7-inch reach advantage on top of a 2-inch leg reach advantage. So when you compound these three height and reach advantages together, it obviously means Magny is much longer than Matthews, and he's obviously built a career off using that length very well. They're both orthodox stance fighters. They both land about the same number of strikes per minute. They're both about the same level of accuracy. Matthews is better defensively. Magny's actually more likely to take his opponents down, or attempt to take his opponents down. Matthews has better takedown defense out of the two and is more aggressive at pursuing submissions on the ground. So Matthews, one of the biggest favourites on the card, and I think a big part of the reason for that is X factors on this fight. The first one being Magny's very old. He's almost 40 years old now, and we're absolutely seeing decline in him, where he's just not as physically imposing as he used to be. His balance is starting to go, his reflexes are starting to go, and things like that. On top of that, Matthews is a very popular Australian fighter. We're speaking about Matthews when he came into the UFC. He came into the UFC on the back of the Ultimate Fighter Smashes UK versus Team Australia, and has been a very popular Australian fighter ever since. So it's going to be difficult for Magny to win a decision against an Australian in Australia. Now, at this stage in their careers, from a technical point of view, I think this is also one of those fights where Jake Matthews is better than Neil Magny everywhere. One of Magny's biggest weaknesses throughout his career, and after 44 pro fights, something that he's never improved, is his takedown offense and ground game. Even though Magny's takedown offense stat shows 54%, which to be fair is pretty bad, in reality his takedown offense is far worse than that, because Magny's one of these guys that if you really commit to taking down and getting on his legs, his balance is totally shot and he will just fall down very, very easily. So Matthews shoots 1 or 2 takedowns on average per fight. Matthews is quite strong from top position. If he really commits to getting Magny down, he should be able to get Magny down no problem and hold him down relatively easily. Now, throughout Magny's career, he's been very good at weaponizing his cardio. He weaponized his cardio to bank a win against Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos in his last fight, and we have seen some situations earlier in Jake Matthews' career when he has slowed, but generally Matthews' cardio is pretty good. It will be very difficult for Magny to make Matthews work hard enough to weaponize his cardio in this one. If it were to happen, I think it would be the same sort of situation that we saw against Mike Mallet, where, you know, Magny is getting pretty much dominated for the first 2 rounds, but then, you know, Mallet has some kind of adrenaline dump and wears down in the third, and Magny's able to make him pay for it. That's really the only way that I could see him weaponizing his cardio against Matthews, because Matthews isn't the kind of guy that's going to slow down a lot before the 3rd round. So in terms of how these two match up from a technical point of view, we've already said Matthews has a big edge on the ground. Magny's one of these guys that if you take him down, put him on his back, which is not difficult to do. If you did do it, he's very weak off his back. He's very easy to hold down. He's active off his back, throwing shots and stuff off his back, but very poor at working his way back up to his feet. So Matthews will have the advantage on the ground. And at this stage in their careers, Matthews is also the more technical striker, and he hits a lot harder. Magny has always lacked power in his hands. He's always been a volume striker, and Matthews hits harder. Nice leg kicks. Magny's always been susceptible to leg kicks. We saw that in the Santiago Ponzinibbio fight. We saw it in the Carlos Prates fight. And Matthews' leg kicks are one of his best weapons. So, yeah, this is one of those fights where it's a very good stylistic matchup for Matthews. I think he wins the fight standing up on the ground, and he's going to be able to neutralize most of the threats that Magny poses to him. It's a very, very good fight for Jake Matthews, and he justifies being a big favourite. Now, you've got to let the odds do the work for you. Even though Matthews is very likely to win this, to get any value on him, you'd have to give him at least an 85% chance of winning, which I can't do, and I don't think you should be able to do either. That's absurd. So whilst Matthews is very likely to win this weekend, his odds absolutely reflect that. There's no value, and you can't bet him, unfortunately. Sorry to be boring. That's just the way it is. In terms of the over-under on this one, I think it's very likely to go deep, actually, this fight. You can see that the odds are in the even money odds range for fight to go to a decision or not to. If you were going to bet the over-under on this one, I would take this fight goes to a decision. If we look at their records, we can see that Magny, even though more of his fights in this later stage of his career where he's not as durable or ending inside the distance, if we then flip over and take a look at Matthews, we can see that for the most part he's a decisionator, right? Decisionator, decision. A few of his fights have ended pretty quickly, but for the most part he is a bit of a decisionator. So as a result, styles make fights. I see this one going deep. So if you want to bet this one to go the distance or not, I would take go the distance. So I hope you found that useful. Let's break down the fight between Justin Tafa and Louis Sutherland. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see the Tafa is the slight favourite. The average odds are around 1.82, which is minus 122 for an implied probability of 55%. If we take a look at the odds on Sutherland, he's around a 1.98 underdog, which is going to be minus 102 for an implied probability of 50%. If you shop around, though, you can bet pretty much both these guys at the same odds. So it's Sutherland's debut, which means you don't have a whole lot of information available on him in terms of the tail of the tape, and we have no stats at all because he's fought a very, very low level of opponent outside the UFC in very small promotions. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, they are both primarily strikers. So Tafa, more of a single shot knockout artist that just looks to time you with that one big counter to put you away. And Sutherland does have power in his hands. He's a big guy, but he's not as... he doesn't have kind of like that raw power, that raw speed, that raw accuracy that Tafa has. He's a bit more of a brawler, which isn't always the best thing to be against a guy like Justin Tafa. So in terms of how they match up when it comes to striking, Tafa's got the power to knock anyone in the division out, but he doesn't throw very high volume. And Sutherland, a lot more volume, but obviously the more he engages Tafa, the more at risk he is of being knocked out. So it's not ideal having more volume against a guy like Tafa, because every time you draw him into an exchange, you're risky in a shot that can put you away. So on the feet, it's kind of like the volume, the aggression of Sutherland versus the technique, the speed, the accuracy, the power of Tafa. Now, when it comes to grappling, it's obviously a huge area of weakness for Tafa. His takedown offense is very bad. His ground game is very, very bad. And so the key to victory for beating Tafa is always to get him down, dominate him on the ground. So this is one of those fights where if it stays standing, it's actually, you can see why they're in the even money odds range, because if you can avoid being knocked out by Tafa, you will very often beat him by decision, just because his volume tends to be pretty low. And Sutherland's cardio isn't bad for a heavyweight, to be fair. But one area where Sutherland does have a big advantage is on the ground. Now, Sutherland is primarily a striker. He doesn't shoot that many takedowns in fights. He does prefer to stand and bang. But obviously it would be quite foolish to try and stand and bang against Tafa. And so I would expect Sutherland to try and grapple in this fight. The problem with Sutherland is he's a big old fat heavyweight, right? Not in the best shape. His takedown entries are stiff and slow. Does shoot takedowns pretty high up above his opponent's hips. And Tafa is a guy that will gamble on the knockout when you enter into his range. So we've seen Tafa face a bunch of guys in the past that when they shoot in for a takedown, instead of him focusing on, getting those underhooks in play and dealing with the threat of the takedown, he's not interested in dealing with the threat of the takedown. He's more interested in letting his hands go and trying to knock you out. Now that makes him even more vulnerable to being taken down, but it also makes him deadly. Because when you fight a big, slow, stiff guy like Sutherland that doesn't have the best MMA grappling, doesn't have the best takedown entries, when Sutherland does close the distance to grab a hold of Tafa and take him down, he is at significant risk of being, KO'd dead. And we've seen Tafa do that to a few guys in the past. So this is one of those fights where it is a tricky one. In situations like this, I usually prefer to go with the more well-rounded guy, which is Sutherland, because he has more ways to win. With his grappling, he kind of has the ability to dictate where the fight takes place. Obviously, the problem with that logic is fights start standing, and because Sutherland is a poor MMA grappler, his risk of being KO'd dead is quite significant before he even gets a chance to get close enough to Tafa to take him down. On top of that, Sutherland has fought a very low level of opponent up until this point in his career. So if you go back and watch Sutherland's past fights, it's been one of those situations where he's a big, strong, powerful heavyweight and he's facing guys that just don't look like fighters. They look like high school teachers and stuff. So to go from that to being on the main card of a UFC event against a very dangerous opponent like Tafa is not easy. So I do think the odds are, pretty much where they should be on this one, because they're both deeply flawed. I wouldn't trust either of these guys with my money. To say the same thing about Tafa, I would say about Jack Jenkins. How can you trust a guy in an MMA contest that has no takedown offense and ground game? But at the same time, big step up in competition for Sutherland. He is sloppy. He is one of these low-level heavyweights. Could easily see Tafa just cracking him, knocking him out pretty easily. So yeah, this fight, it's not that interesting for me. It's going to be great for the Just Bleed boys, for the fans in the arena. They'll probably get to see a big highlight reel knockout. But from a betting point of view, this one's an absolute minefield. And the odds, like I say, probably where they should be. Now, obviously, very unlikely this one goes to a decision, because you're probably going to either see Tafa capitulate and get overwhelmed if he gets taken down, or you're going to see Sutherland get brutally knocked out. And the odds quite steep on the fight not to go to a decision, so they reflect that. So yeah, I hope you found that breakdown useful. Let me know what you think about this fight, because I don't really have a strong opinion on it, to be honest with you. May as well, one of those fights where you may as well flip a coin on it. So let me know what you think, and let's move on to a fight that is a lot more interesting in the next one. Now let's break down one of the most interesting fights on this card, which is going to be Charlie Campbell versus Tom Nolan. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Nolan is the favourite at average odds of about 1.65, which is going to be minus 154 for an implied probability of 61%. And if we take a look at the odds on Campbell, he's about a 2.24 underdog, which is going to be plus 124 for an implied probability of 45%. So Campbell is 30 years old, 6 foot tall with a 72-inch reach. Nolan, 25 years old, 6'3" with a 73-inch reach. So we can see Nolan a little bit taller, but they both have the same reach, and age not too meaningful in this one. The only X factor to really take into consideration is that Tom Nolan is Australian, and this event is obviously taking place in Australia. So Nolan will have home advantage on his side, and obviously this is one of those fights that could be pretty competitive, so having home advantage is pretty nice, and it's certainly a good thing for Nolan, just makes it slightly more likely that he will win. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, we don't know tons about Charlie Campbell's grappling. So we know both these guys are primarily strikers, but we have seen Campbell mix in some grappling in his last fight against Trevor Peek. And obviously Nolan used the grappling heavy game plan to win his last fight against Vyacheslav Borshev. But with Campbell, he has only had 11 pro fights. And before he came to the UFC, we can see that he had, he'd fought a pretty low level of opponent. 0-0, 0-0, 3-1, 2-0, 2-1, 5-4, 6-2, 8-1. You get the idea. Lost against Chris Duncan on the Contender Series. And generally speaking, he hasn't fought a particularly good level of MMA grappler in his career. Obviously the Alex Reyes fight ended in 3.5 minutes, and Trevor Peek is predominantly a striker who's pretty bad on the ground. So what we know about Tom Nolan is that his MMA grappling looked pretty solid in his last fight against Vyacheslav Borshev. Now yes, Borshev is easy to take down and hold down, but Nolan demonstrated good MMA grappling IQ, decent amount of physicality, decent technique. So while the grappling is a bit of an unknown because we don't know tons about Campbell's grappling, with Nolan's size and how he looked against Borshev and the flashes of grappling we've seen from Campbell in his past fights, you'd have to give the edge to Nolan on the ground. Both these guys have got very good cardio. They both fight at a high pace, so they naturally slow down a little as fights wear on, but nothing major. Both these guys can go pretty hard for 15 minutes. Now, in terms of how they both stand up, in terms of how they both look when it comes to stand up and striking, Nolan is the more technical out of the two. He's one of these guys that for a big guy, 6'3", which is abnormally long and tall for the division, he does move pretty well. Defensively, he's not bad, to be fair. I mean, it's not easy for a long, tall, lanky guy to go the distance against, a very heavy-handed opponent like Vyacheslav Borshev. I know that he was brutally knocked out by Nicholas Motta, but outside of that, that's his only knockout loss in his entire career. Yes, he's only had 10 pro fights, but point being, for a big guy, he moves pretty well, to be fair, and the Borshev fight was a good illustration of that. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, Nolan's the more technical striker. He's better defensively. Probably hits a bit harder as well. My thing with Campbell, though, is he does have that doggedness in him. He fights at a high pace. He is dogged. He is tough. He is durable. And in terms of durability, I would trust Campbell more than Nolan in like a knockdown, drag-out war. Just because these abnormally long and tall guys like Nolan they are more likely to get dinged. They are more likely to get rocked, wobbled, knocked out, dropped, that kind of thing. And Nolan does get dinged and caught clean from time to time. His chin's not terrible. The Borshev fight showed that, but I would trust Campbell's durability a lot more. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, this is one of those fights where I think Nolan is a bit better than Campbell everywhere, like 20 to 30% better than Campbell everywhere, which would justify him being the slight favourite, and Nolan is a lot more likely to win in this fight, in my opinion. He also has home advantage, which is something that sweetens the deal very much. So this is one of those fights where I'm very tempted to bet Nolan. I haven't decided if I'm going to pull the trigger on him yet. My main concern is that I don't know a lot about Campbell's takedown offense, ground game, and so I don't know if he might actually have the edge on the ground against Nolan. I don't think he will, because there were flashes of grappling in the Peak fight where he didn't look great. But never say never until we get conclusive proof in actual fight footage. I don't like to make assumptions. Having said that, the odds on Nolan aren't bad. So Nolan is a very tempting bet for me. I think he's far more likely to win this weekend. But I haven't made my mind up on if I'm going to bet him yet. But I do think he is a bit better than Campbell everywhere. And the cherry on top of the cake is that home advantage. It will not be easy for Campbell to go to Australia and beat an Australian in his home nation. The crowd will be right behind him, and this is the fight that kicks off the main card as well. So crowd are going to be absolutely litty. Now, both these guys are tough as nails. We've seen that in their past fights. The Trevor Peek, Campbell's debut against Trevor Peek was an absolute war, and we've seen Nolan in some tough fights as well. So I do think this fight is quite likely to go deep, even though it'll be put full of violence and full of action because of how aggressive both of them are. But if you do want to bet this fight, you know, to go the distance or to not go the distance, I would lean more towards the over 2.5 rounds of dog odds. I think the dog odds on the over gives you a much better risk to reward ratio than the odds of, you know, 1.55, which would be what, minus, what would those odds be about? If we put them in, see what the implied probability and everything is. Yeah, minus 182, implied probability is 65%. I'd much prefer to be on the over 2.5 rounds at an implied probability of 40%, because I think it is pretty much 50-50 whether the fight does go over or not, which gives you a very nice margin of value on those odds, although his odds are only 2.5 on a couple sites, so you'd have to shop around to get them. That bet is far less attractive at odds of 2.10, because like I say, I did just cap it at about 50% to go to a decision or not. So yeah, very, very interesting fight. I do lean towards Campbell, and he's a very tempting bet. So I hope you found those breakdowns useful. If you did, please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Join my live betting group, because we make a profit 74% of the time in terms of months, right? So if you join us for a year, you're going to make a profit in 74% of those months, which makes joining our live betting group an absolute no-brainer. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with another video for next week's card, that big pay-per-view. And I think there's going to be some very, very good bets on next week's card, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you in next week's YouTube video. So like, subscribe, and I'll see you all very soon. Nice one, guys. Take care. Bye.